Greetings, friends of liberty. Are so many people in Britain correct in believing mass immigration to have caused mass sexual violence? Is it not an indubitable fact? Alexandra Phillips and Amy Gallagher believe so, and in their recently published 44-minute documentary exposed how immigration has caused a rape crisis in Britain, we see one of the more detailed video presentations ever made of this commonly held belief. Immigration is the cause not just of Britain's past rape crises, such as those so rightly and famously protested for many years by Tommy Robinson, but also of the current epidemic of sexual abuse and violence. Is this belief true? If not, what else conceivably could be the cause? Let's examine her descriptive and causal claims and then evaluate how well they pass scientific muster. Ms. Phillips, in essence, begins by justifying the need and purpose of this expose, saying, between 2011 and 2025, taking all UK newspapers combined, the British press have run 8 times more stories on George Floyd than the grooming gangs and 50 times as many articles on the far right. She continues, when last year I dared to suggest that the increase in sexual abuse and harassment was coming from foreign men, so taboo was the suggestion that the clip went viral. And when she looked for credible British data on these crime rates, she found none. When I started working on this documentary a few months ago, I was unable to find any official statistics examining the correlation between country of origin and the perpetrators of sex crimes in the UK. And so she started collecting all the data she could for Britain and European countries, thus discovering, as she shows us, the following stats. A, rates of rape in England and Wales have quadrupled in just 10 years. B, in Germany, those of Afghan heritage were 11 times, and African heritage were 11 times, and Afghan 16 times more likely to rape than white Germans. C, in Finland, Afghans and Iraqis were 40 times more likely to be convicted of sex crimes. D, in Sweden, the rates for rape were 129 times greater for Algerians and 69 times greater for Afghans than native Swedes. E, in Italy, Afghans were 15 times and Africans 12 times more likely to be rapists. F, returning to England, we find in 2024 that foreign nationals were more than 3 times as likely to be convicted of sex crimes, that the frequency of acid attacks in the UK is presently the highest of all recorded nations worldwide, and that honor-based abuse increased by 60% from 2020 to 2022. In terms of female genital mutilation, FGM in England, we find that it increased by 15% from 2022 to 2023, with 37,000 cases reported by the NHS since 2015. Having shown us the differences in the prevalence of rape and sexual crimes by ethnicity, Ms. Phillips briefly emphasizes the fact of increased migration, saying, migration has added at least 3.7 million people to the UK population since 2010. And since 2016, more than 160,000 people have arrived from small boats, mostly young men from Muslim countries such as Afghanistan, Syria, Turkey, Iran, and Iraq. Having said that, she quickly returns to the various ethnic qualities of Muslim migrants. A, she thus interviews writer Yasmin Mohammed, who describes in detail the Muslim practice of what's called taharrush, the collective mob molestation or worse by dozens of men or more of women in public places. This practice came to light most notoriously at the Cologne Cathedral on New Year's Eve 2015-16, when likely over 1,000 German women were sexually molested or raped by flash mobs of Muslim immigrants. The German PC media failing to report what had happened for days afterwards, and the legal system only convicting in the end a handful of men. B, the legal handicaps encountered by women in Muslim countries are notorious, with, for example, the failure of Islamic jurisprudence to grant women equal legal status to men, with women, 1, not being allowed to divorce, 2, their testimony in court being worth 1/2, that of a man, and 3, the age of consent for women just 9 years old. C, her interviewees also mentioned the lengthy 1,500-year history of sexual slavery in Islam justified in the Quran. D, another ex-Muslim interviewed, Nuria Khan, points out that these Muslim misogynists will sometimes specifically target women, as they did when they bombed an Ariana Grande concert in Manchester, killing 22 and injuring hundreds. Tragically, it may have been the political correctness and Islamophilia of MI5 that might have prevented the bomb plot from being discovered in time. E, another highly significant cultural aspect, as we're aware with the spread of woke, is that a new moral narrative has taken hold, making it almost impossible for anyone to speak out on this issue. For decades, schools, universities, the mainstream media, and the public sector have been pushing ideas such as white privilege, white fragility, and anti-racism. We're told that while white people cannot experience racism, they themselves are inherently riddled with a fountain of hateful prejudice towards others, and it's often women who are drawn to such toxic, woke doctrine. F. And here, of course, we run smack into the two-tiered system of British justice, where those with brown skin are excused of crimes which would land either white people or those on the right in jail. The typical example here was the incident of the woman who turned to the police after being spat on. She wasn't helped by them. Instead, she was apprehended because she used the word filthy migrant to describe the perpetrators. As Ms. Phillips summarizes, the message is clear. There is no problem. And if you dare to think there is, then you are the problem. In summary, all these aspects of Islamic culture, of course, easily explain why rape rates such as those first noticed many decades ago in Rotherham, Rochdale, and Telford have risen so precipitously in Britain and many European countries. Let's now turn to the central question raised by my review. Is mass immigration the cause of the increased rates of rape and sexual violence? Or is it really an effect? In order to answer and to understand the nature of the causality involved, let me use an analogy I've used on a number of previous occasions. Imagine a drunk who has gone on a bender drinking huge amounts of vodka, gin, and wine every day, hardly eating any solid food and getting little sleep. As a result, after 3 months, he catches pneumonia, but when he is well again, his doctor claims that it was the pneumonia that was the actual cause and not everything that he did to compromise his immune system. Ms. Phillips is like this doctor. She's utterly right in pointing out the harmful nature of pneumonia, but misunderstanding that it was the weakness of the patient that led to his catching pneumonia in the first place. But how could that be? Let's outline the many ways in which the national immune response of Britain, so to speak, has been compromised, thus letting the Islamic pathogen grow in size and virulence. Number 1, Britain has been a welfare state now for close to a century, and as many of the countries that have the greatest problems with immigrants, countries like Germany, Sweden, and France, they too have highly developed welfare states. In fact, arriving immigrants back in 2016, coming from Africa or the Middle East, entering Europe, would talk to fellow immigrants on their phones, finding and moving to countries that would give them the highest personal and familial benefits for free. It is thus no coincidence that Britain at this moment is facing a benefits scandal, since so many people are living off of the state, getting lucrative unemployment and disability payouts, often for fictitious reasons. These have not just highly incentivized native Britons, but also those arriving in the small boats. Why does no one in reform point out that you can cut down on the flow of immigrants, or at least bad immigrants, by simply getting rid of all public welfare payments? What this means is that for close to a century, Britain and European countries have been attracting millions of freeloading Muslim immigrants who never otherwise would have made the trip, and who then imported all their dependents or wives to sometimes make more Islamic, sometimes misogynistic babies. You'll never hear this highly relevant fact from Ms. Phillips. How welfare states attract bad migrants. And not only does a welfare state attract a larger proportion of freeloading migrants, but in many cases it fails to make them better people because it simply doesn't make them work for a living once they're in the country. So a double whammy. Compromise of the British institutional immune system, number 2. Almost as important, Ms. Phillips rightly points out that the harms of the modern ideologies of CRT and DEI, saying, for example, in addition, that statistics show that particularly university-educated women have become increasingly racially left-leaning. They champion refugees, mass immigration, and a band of feminism that teaches it is their country and culture, the West, that has an oppressive patriarchy. In my experience, it is the young girls who are most keen to adopt concepts such as unconscious bias and white privilege. They certainly seem to be the biggest group of people swallowing the whole woke textbook. This is all true and utterly important to recognize. But again, what Ms. Phillips doesn't understand in the slightest is the cause that all these ideologies come primarily from a system of public education that has grown enormously in power, funding, and control since World War II. It is this increased funding and regulatory control, especially at the university level in Britain, just as in the US, that has created these ideologies which never would exist otherwise. How do we know that? Because the private sector largely dislikes them and would never pay for funding woke professors. Having seen these two significant institutional failures of British society that have contributed to the problem, might there be others? Yes, there are. Ms. Phillips naturally misses these too, again, just pointing her finger at the pneumonia instead of the negligent conditions which led to it. That brings us to number 3, the Equality Acts. As the paper I reviewed last week from IEA showed, the Equality Acts in England have helped reinforce on a legal societal level the anti-white and Islamophilic ideologies that have been created in increasingly public universities. This exact same effect have been found in the United States, as Richard Hanania's The Origins of Woke, which I reviewed here, showed in great detail. More? Yes. Number 4, the drug war. Sexual trafficking gangs often engage in other black market activities as well, and also increase the rates of general crime. But by legalizing drugs, Britain would destroy 95% of the profit and power that these violent gangs make, thus not only eliminating them, but also making it easier to focus on sexual trafficking and rape gangs. But would Nigel ever mention this? Nope, it's the immigrants. Number 5, handgun laws. Contrary to what virtually everyone else says, allowing Britons to own handguns and weapons would allow the public to defend themselves. They would certainly do a much better job of it than the pathetic British bobbies now do. But back over 120 years ago, when most Britons could own any firearms they wanted, as I reviewed in Joyce Lee Malcolm's Guns and Violence, The English Experience, homicide rates were lower than they are now per capita. Rape rates then being 1/20th of what they were in the year 2000. Robbery rates being 300 times less in 1900 than the year 2000, and burglary rates 50 times less. All responsible Britons should be able to own and carry firearms. This would reduce crime rates significantly. Finally, immune compromisation, number 6. Get rid of public broadcasting, the BBC. All it does is support the narratives of the left and the denigration of those like Tommy Robinson and many others who would protect Britain from the Muslim rapists preying on young girls and women. A free society needs a free press. Finally, let me ask one more question. Is there a country historically that, unlike modern Britain, has had completely uncontrolled immigration, while at the same time having robust free market institutions, such as no welfare state, relatively unintrusive and unregulated public education, no drug war, no handgun laws, and no state broadcasting? Yes, the United States from about 1850 to 1924. Did that social science experiment succeed? Yes, beyond everyone's wildest dreams, vaulting the U.S. to the position of world's #1 superpower. Happy for my part that Miss Phillips has the courage to throw the spotlight on how disproportionately Muslims are engaging in rape and sexual crimes throughout England and Europe, but disappointed that she understands not a single one of the many British institutional weaknesses that have led to this horrendous result. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.